Welcome to today's podcast. I'm Stephanie Wilson. I'm a partner here at Berenzweig, Leonard, and director of our firm's government contracts practice. I'm joined today by Brian Guenther, who is the president of Exceed Cybersecurity I.T services. Brian is a cybersecurity and compliance expert that works with regulated businesses with a focus on helping government contractors manage risk and become compliant with cybersecurity requirements. Thank you for joining us, Brian.
Of course. Thanks for having me today.
We have a great program today on CMMC and what contractors need to know about DOD's cybersecurity requirements. And I've asked Brian to join me today to answer some questions that often arise around cybersecurity compliance issues for government contractors, specifically in the DOD space. But before we jump into this topic, Brian, I'd like to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about your company, Exceed Cyber, and how you help government contractors.
So Exceed Cybersecurity helps companies, as you indicated, in the compliance-driven space, identify the risk profile and their need to comply with certain contract or regulatory compliance matters. So we help this business understand what that is, what that looks like, and how we can best make them comply and then become state compliant going forward. So in a nutshell.
Great. So probably the most talked about topic in the GovCon cybersecurity space these days is DOD's CMMC program. So first off, the big question, what is CMMC?
Sure. So CMMC stands for Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. Long term, but essentially what it means is that a government, in this case a defense contractor, must become and maintain a certain posture of cybersecurity compliance in order to be able to safeguard information that the DOD deems necessary to protect.
And so why was CMMC created?
So CMMC was created out of an abundance of necessity, really what it came down to. For many years, the DOD had effectively considered this a self-attestation process where they allowed these defense contractors to say, well, you know, we're adhering to these compliance requirements around cybersecurity or having proper security controls in place, but really there was no checking, just self-attestation. Hey, it's sort of on the the trust model. We just trust that you did it. What was found when there were audits that were done, spot checks, if you will, by the DOD, is they identified that many of those organizations, frankly the vast majority, said they complied or said they did the certain security controls or practices, but in fact they didn't, and maybe they did them poorly. And so that in probably the 2014, 15, 16 timeframe bore the necessity for a real framework to be developed that could then be not only proven but also implemented and then actually enforced through an assessment process by a third party. So that's really where that came from. It all comes down to the need to make sure that these organizations are compliant, because in the long run, what they had found was that these nation states were effectively eating our lunch and stealing valuable data, right? And information about the DOD that we didn't like very much. So this had to change.
So obviously it's very critical, especially in the DOD space. Does the CMMC only apply to DOD contractors?
At this time, yes, it only applies to DOD contractors right now. There are other agencies that are looking at CMMC as a cybersecurity framework that they can then implement themselves. But for now, DOD is the only one that is actively looking at implementing it. They actually commissioned the study and then the ultimate creation by Carnegie Mellon and the Software Engineering Institute and other very smart people at Johns Hopkins University and consultants to put together the CMMC framework a few years back. And now it's been a very slow process to getting it rolled out because, it's like turning the Titanic. Yeah. It's a massive endeavor to do this across the defense industrial base.
Are all DOD contractors going to need to comply with CMMC?
So all of them will need to comply at least at some level.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So there are different levels of CMMC?
Absolutely. There are 3 different levels and what are called maturity levels. And those maturity levels are maturity level 1. And so I'll give you kind of a really quick outline of what that means. So I'll give you some examples as well. Maturity level 1 is basically you just have to do very basic, what's called basic cybersecurity hygiene. And that, consider yourself, let's say if you are a facilities management organization or you do janitorial services and you clean a variety of different DOD buildings, let's say whether they're on post or not, you may not have any kind of specific sensitive information about data or information or what's going on in the location, but there is some access, right, that employees may have. Mm-hmm. But there's really no access to information readily, at least. Well, at least we hope that's the case. And so those folks have to have a basic cybersecurity hygiene and have to show what that is, right? And so that's a very simple level. And this, what you have to understand is that the CMMC maturity levels are iterative in nature, which means they build on each other. So the next level, the intermediate level, as it were, is what's called the second level. You have to actually put in place and protect 100 and implement 110 different what are called practices. It's a lot.
That's a lot, yeah.
It is a lot. And, it's not just a one and done thing. We'll talk about that maybe a little bit later. But 110 different practices. And what the government really wants you to do is they want you to, in this case, a DOD, they want you to protect the controlled unclassified information, or CUI, to make sure that that information that sits on the organization, what's called the organization is seeking certification, the government contractor, has on their systems, and that information is safeguarded. Okay? And the third level is maturity level 3. And that's usually going to apply to larger contractors. Think of like big primes like Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, CACI, the large ones that are going to have more sensitive information, such as different types of controlled and classified information, such as controlled technical information, but also they may have access to and be storing ITAR information, International Trade and Arms Regulation, that is much more sensitive. So there are 3 different levels, and depending on, we can talk about it a bit later, depending on where you fall in that process, you may have to attain a specific level. Most only have to attain level 1, some 2, and very few 3.
So no, I feel like CMMC has been talked about for several years, and I think that the dates have been pushed out and whatnot. So why is it critical now for defense contractors to really pay attention to CMMC?
It's important now because if they're not already doing it today and paying attention, they're already behind the 8 ball. It's critical because if they don't do this, they're not going to be able to qualify for contracts starting as early as next year. And there's a pretty big business reason to do that.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
And if, let's say, they do get contracts that require CMMC compliance, and they don't do that, and they said they did but don't do it, there's potentially big trouble ahead.
Yeah, so what are some of those risks they might face if they don't comply with CMMC?
Yeah, the biggest risks that they face, it depends on how these organizations attest to what was done or what wasn't done. So let's assume they said, oh yeah, we did all these things, and let's say they lie about it. Well, they can't get very far with it because ultimately CMMC requires a third-party audit and assessment by another party to essentially sign off that those things were done. But worst case scenario, if they were to lie about it, there is something called the False Claims Act. And that was established, I believe, during the Civil War time frame, but it has an interesting backstory I won't get into. But the False Claims Act, if there was an organization that was pretty egregious in its claims around, yeah, we implemented the CMMC requirements, but they didn't do so, then the DOD could refer to the Department of Justice, and they could then bring a false claims suit against the organization and its executives.
Yeah, so there's definitely some high stakes and real risks here for non-compliance.
Absolutely.
Can you explain a little bit about how CMMC helps protect sensitive government information?
Sure. The way that it protects the information is through the implementation of these cybersecurity, what are called practices. CMMC is based on an open framework called NIST 800-171, National Institute of Standards and Technology, and explicitly the 800-171 framework has been around for many years. It's actually its current, they just released the 3rd iteration of it, the ROD3, and that framework is effectively developed and designed for organizations to protect controlled unclassified information. And when those components are implemented, the likelihood of that data falling into the wrong hands and information falling into the wrong hands is vastly diminished. Not impossible, but vastly diminished. It's all about, frankly, about identifying and managing risk.
So how does CMMC differ from other cybersecurity frameworks or standards?
One of the major reasons or ways in which it differs is that it requires a third-party audit. So much like there are other frameworks like SANS and other cybersecurity frameworks that are not necessarily rooted in compliance. They're more like for good security, what's called security hygiene. However, in this case, the primary reason is at the end of the journey, which can take 12, 18, or even 24 months, there's going to be a third party that comes in and that identifies the gaps that you have that you haven't closed yet, or they certify you as saying, hey, you check all the boxes, you did all the things you're supposed to do, you actually have a culture of cybersecurity, and we believe you've actually done all the things you're supposed to do, and we attest as a third party, which is separate from the guide, we'll talk about that a bit later, we can attest now that these things were done appropriately, and we feel that the risk level is properly managed.
Okay, so and that differs from what you were explaining before. It was sort of a trust basis, right? You just assumed that the contractor was doing it, or they would attest themselves they did it. Now you're having this third party come in and confirm that they've taken all of those appropriate steps.
That's correct. That's a third party coming in, and that's where one of the major differences. It really uses an existing cybersecurity framework, the NIST 800-171 framework, but then says we're going to bolt onto that these requirements that make you have to become audited, what they really call an assessment. It's not truly an audit, but they call an assessment by a third party, and to make sure that you do what you said you did.
So what are some of the key steps that government contractors should take to prepare for that CMMC certification process?
So the first step is to identify where they are today. Like any journey, you have to start with where am I? Where am I at today? Create a baseline. And once you have the baseline in place, that baseline then allows you to say, okay, I have a starting point today, and then identifying where you need to go, which is implementing these entire 110 controls. Well, some organizations may already have done some of these things. It's just part of their standard cybersecurity practices they have in place anyway, right? The larger the organization, the potentially, not always, potentially more likely to always already have these in place. But then you want to identify, okay, well, we need to make this gap assessment. We're here today, we need to go, point A, we need to get to point Z. What's everything in between? That's a gap assessment. And that gap assessment allows you to identify what have we done, what do we still need to do, what has to happen for us to get there. And that's where the guide, if you will, whether it's you yourself as an organization, you do it internally, or you hire a firm to help with that, can assist with that process.
So how can government contractors assess their current cybersecurity posture in relation to these CMMC requirements?
So the easiest way to do that is, as I said just a moment ago, is creating this baseline, identifying where they are, knowing where they need to go, and then effectively coming with a strategy that's going to be, is going to identify where they need to be based on their compliance requirement, based on their contract requirements, and then come up with a plan over the next, let's say, 6 to 12 or 18 months to then implement these solutions, what are called these technical controls, or maybe processes, or maybe even policies, right? The policies are the laws, if you will, that govern how you conduct and do your business as it relates certainly to your business in general, or as it relates to CMMC itself. So it's, again, starting with the assessment and then having somebody that guides you through that process. And sometimes it may be an internal person, maybe an internal resource. It may also be somebody that you hire from the outside, like a certified or registered practitioner.
And so a registered practitioner, can you just describe what's that role a little bit?
Sure. Registered or certified practitioners, and those are different levels of certification. Those are folks that have gone through training and have been tested and have been vetted by the cybersecurity, by the CMMC, what's called the accreditation body. This is essentially the accreditation body that has created this whole CMMC ecosystem. They're a nonprofit organization that's actually based here in the DC area. And they work very closely with the DOD to create this framework around how we're going to create and roll out, and ultimately implement and manage the CMMC process overall. And so that those practitioners, the lower level is registered practitioner, and the next higher level is a certified practitioner. They have different capabilities and skills in how they can execute and help a company. But that's ultimately one level of in ways in which you can show that you've gone through certain training, study, but also the certification that shows that you know your material and you can help the organization.
So what are some common challenges or roadblocks that organizations face when preparing for CMMC?
So some of the most common challenges are that they don't know where to start. Okay, they just don't know where to begin. They have no sense of where they are, where they're going. They may be running it alone. And again, not to sound self-serving in any way, but this is where they really need to look inward and say, do we have enough information on how to do this? And that's where they can often reach out and find an organization that can help them with that process. Some of the biggest roadblocks tend to be that they haven't identified really what maturity level they need to be at, whether it's 1, 2, or 3, and that's where it's really important to work with your prime. If you're a sub, working with your prime. If you're a sub of a sub, identifying where you need to be at the contract actually state. And so you really need to identify what maturity level do you need to be at anyway. And if you're a janitorial services company, you probably only need to be at maturity level 1. And that bar is fairly low. Those are 17 practices versus 110. So a big disparity between the two, right?
So you mentioned, and I think it's probably especially critical for some of those smaller businesses or, like a maintenance company like that, using outsourced professionals to help you. So in what ways can a registered practitioner assist organizations in both understanding those CMMC requirements and determining what applies to their organizations?
Right. So ultimately what the practitioner does is create a roadmap for them, right? They help them identify, again, like I said, where they are today, create a roadmap based on a gap assessment, what they need to do, and then ultimately being able to implement and create a training process, but also, guiding them through what systems you need, what process do you need, what additional resources might you require in order to become ready for your final, again, third-party independent assessment. So in a nutshell, that's really where they can help them.
What role does training play in CMMC compliance, and how does that registered practitioner assist in that process?
Right. So training is a critical component to what we in the cybersecurity space do, because we can put all these controls and processes and technical systems in place to try to keep the bad guys out of the network and out of your data. But in the end, who's the weakest link? It's the people, right? The people are the weakest link. So security awareness training is a really big part of this. This is not the only part, but this is the biggest part, is making sure that the organization has a culture of cybersecurity. And a big part of that is to making sure that their staff and their team is trained appropriately on the risks and the constantly changing landscape as far as the threats that are out there that have to be aware of, to not open the proverbial front door when they have, a festooned a castle with a moat around the crocodiles and all that stuff. They're like, we'll just raise the portcullis, drop the bridge, and just come on in, right? Because you look trustworthy, right? But knowing who those people are, those organizations, and there's essentially those bad actors that are trying to come in the front door, like one of them might be phishing, for example.
Can you provide some examples of either cybersecurity policies or procedures that government contractors might need to implement for CMMC compliance?
Sure. Typically, I'm going to give you a few examples, maybe 2 or 3, but generally speaking, if we did it or the organization did it themselves, typically this is all undergirded by what's called a written information security plan. So most organizations, and it also, by the way, just depends on which level of CMMC compliance they have to be at, whether it's maturity level 1, 2, or 3, that will dictate different types of policies that are required to be rolled out. As far as I'm aware, the maturity level 1 doesn't require any policies per se, right? Maturity level 2 and 3 do. So some of those examples could be a written information security plan that effectively dictates how your policies are rolled out through the organization, and there are subservient policies. Think of these as, sort of riders, think of that way, like tag-on laws. One of them might be a incident response policy, right? If we are under attack by a malicious actor, how do we respond? How do we act? What do we do, right? And practicing those things. The policy actually dictates these things can be practiced on a regular basis through what's called a tabletop exercise. Kind of a funny term, but really what it means is that we've practiced. If we get attacked, what's going to happen? Another example of a great of a policy that is a really good thing to have for any organization, not just CMMC, will be like a bring your own device policy. We all have these amazing computers in our pockets or our purses, if you will, that are like smartphones, for example, like whether you have an iPhone or Android or a Windows phone. Let's hope you don't have a Windows phone. But let's say that you did, and most organizations see the value in not having to procure or acquire phones for their entire staff. They say, well, we'll let you bring your own device. So that's BYOD, right? That's the acronym. But those devices have to be protected and locked down and secured, because maybe information from the organization is accessed from that device, but the company wants to make sure that that can be controlled to some degree as well, right? And so another policy may mean, for example, access control policy. What are you allowed to access? What locations, what data, what systems? And most organizations should really practice what's called the least privilege policy, which is you should only access that to which you really have to get to do your job. And that's it. So those are some examples of policies you might see.
And, obviously technology is always evolving and, there are new risks out there. It sounds like this is something that is a continuing obligation, right? I mean, it's not going to necessarily be a one and done to get your initial certification. What are some of the ongoing requirements and how can a registered practitioner or internally, how do you kind of monitor what changes and updates need to be made?
Sure. So there are really three major components. And one of them is first of all, making sure that you're continuously monitoring all these systems that you've implemented throughout this process. You use the term one and done. That's a term that we use all the time. This is not a one and done situation. The initial identification, the gap assessment, the initial assessment gets you to that point, right? But there's a culture of cybersecurity. This has to continue going forward. And every time you're assessed a few years thereafter on a continuous basis, you have to prove that you're still maintaining that. So continuous monitoring and logging of the systems, having proper incident response plans in place, and making sure that you're also assessing risks on a regular basis. Doing like risk assessments, penetration tests, other type of vulnerability assessments are a key component to making sure that you're staying abreast of all of those threats and risks that are out there. Because in the end, all of this really, if it boils down to, is risk management. It's really what this is, right? It's identifying risk and then making sure that you can kind of either manage that risk in some fashion or another.
What strategies or best practices can a registered practitioner recommend for implementing cybersecurity controls in a cost-effective manner?
Sure. So there are a couple different components, but one of them is identifying what you have today. Can we leverage what you have in place today? What resources are you using today? How can we best leverage those? Another part is whether, based on risk, identifying risk, which is done through continuous vulnerability and risk assessments, is identifying what other investments the organization may need to make in order to best protect the organization and, again, not just reach compliance, but really in the end, the organization should want to be secure and protect itself, right? Because compliance and cybersecurity aren't necessarily the same thing.
Mm-hmm. And how can a registered practitioner support organizations in preparing for a CMMC assessment by a third-party assessor?
Right. So the way that they do this is that not only from the beginning on, when they help them do the baseline assessment, which we talked about, and then identifying the gaps and seeing where they are. So being that Sherpa, right, sort of guiding them up to the top of the mountain, right? And then you can sort of see where we are. Okay, great. We've summited the mountain. We're here. And we've now achieved what we need to achieve, but then it's also making sure that all of the components, the systems, and the what we call artifacts. For example, if you put a control in place, a technical control, you have to be able to prove that to the assessor, to the auditor per se, right? You have to be able to show them what's in place, what's there, maybe what's missing, for example. And then in the end, you can also be an integral part of helping select a certified third-party assessment organization, right? We talked about this independent third party. You can introduce your client, in this case our client, or the defense contractor. The practitioner will help them then identify some of those third-party assessors, introduce them, and then shepherd them or herd them through that process in the end to make sure they get through it all together. They can, again, just to be very clear, they can decide to do this internally if they choose. But if it's just, because a lot of this can be very overwhelming. There's a lot of like, oh my God, we don't know what this means. There's all kinds of nomenclature and verbiage in here. They may not even have a security team at all. And so, or even a compliance person, right? Even if they have a compliance person, maybe more business compliance, but not technical compliance.
Yeah,
so there's a lot to understand.
And I assume it's also a very time-consuming process as well. So even if you wanted to do it internally, you'd have to have those internal resources that can dedicate, it sounds like, a significant amount of time to this process.
Absolutely. That's very true. And we actually even, sometimes we have some challenges with that, right? We're working with clients and they say, we're like, okay, who's going to be your point of contact? Who's your point person with whom we are going to exchange information, ask for artifacts, ask for information, whatever that might be. And that's something that the organization has to be ready for as well. Who is going to be the owner? Do they have the time to do this? It depends on the size of the organization. If it's maybe 10 or 15 people, it might be the owner. It certainly shouldn't be the office manager, more than likely, right? But it should be somebody who really has the skills, the wherewithal, and has to some degree the ability to speak on behalf of the organization.
Can you describe some of the potential benefits for government contractors who receive those higher levels of CMMC certifications?
If they were to receive a higher level, for example, let's say maturity level 3, which is generally not needed very often. It's anticipated that that will only be needed maybe 10 or even 15% on the high level, that there be not as many organizations that need maturity level 3. But let's say if you did, let's say you're a janitorial services firm and you say, I'm going to expand. I want to now offer additional services that require me to process, store, transmit, create this controlled unclassified information, or CUI, which CMMC is all about that. It's about safeguarding that data, right? That's really what the DOD cares about. This is really foundational. This is critical, okay? But if you have the higher level certification, not only have you now done the work, you also now can bid for these contracts that otherwise you'd be prohibited from bidding on. Mm-hmm. And that's something that I think is really critical for your audience to know and to understand when they're listening to this and what we're talking about, is know that if they delay this process, they're going to be behind the 8 ball, because it takes a considerable amount of time to complete it, right? Don't just sit there, contemplate it and say, what's it going to cost me? Know that you have to do it. It's a requirement. And if you do this, you will actually have a competitive advantage in the marketplace, because a lot of your counterparts, if you will, I'm talking to the camera directly, right? A lot of your counterparts and colleagues out there who are competitors, they may not have done this. You will have a competitive advantage because you're done, and you now can officially and legally bid on these contracts knowing you've done the right parts.
And I know you said that there's not currently a requirement for contractors who are not in the DOD space to comply. But it sounds like there would also be a benefit for that, right? I mean, you could talk up these, systems that you have in place or structures you have in place, the framework, all of that, all your cybersecurity plans and policies. And it seems like that would be a good selling point for a company, even if they're not necessarily a DOD contractor.
I could not agree more. I think that's totally fair and a good point. Hadn't thought about that to that extent, but that's totally true. If you were to say to if you were to have the ability to have a conversation with during the bidding process of the contracting officer, all that's pretty regulated pretty tightly. But if you were to do that, I think you would have a competitive advantage as well outside the DOD space. Let's say it's Homeland Security, or maybe it's VA, or whomever. If you could show that maturity level, the cybersecurity maturity level, right, which is what this is, and show you're safeguarding data, it would probably to some degree instill confidence in other agencies as well.
In your experience, what are some common either misconceptions or myths about CMMC, and what are some steps or things that a registered practitioner can do to clarify those?
Sure. Some of the biggest common misconceptions tend to be that either CMMC is not coming for them, right? That they don't have to deal with it. That's not going to happen anytime soon because it's been going on for so long. There's a bit of people kind of getting tired of hearing about it, but it's never going to come. But in the end, I think the biggest misconception is that they may not need to comply and don't need to make the investment. But if they don't, of course, we talked about what the repercussions could be.
Right.
So that's probably the number one.
Yeah, and I think just following on that, even if it is a company that isn't currently in the DoD space, if they don't start thinking about this now, they're going to limit their ability to go into that space in the future, right? Like you said, it takes a significant amount of time to get up to speed, and we know this is coming down the road. And so if a company is looking at what contract opportunities they're going to pursue in the future, right, they don't necessarily want to cut off all of DoD, right? I mean, that's such a huge customer within the government. Right. Obviously, compliance is a big part of that. Yeah. So what is the current deadline for CMMC implementation?
So great question. If we look at a crystal ball and sort of start to try to look past the clouds in the crystal ball, ultimately, all joking aside, nobody really knows the exact deadline or implementation time frame. But what we're seeing today and what we believe to be happening, the best information we have today on the CMMC accreditation body that works closely with the DOD, as I shared earlier. Right now we're looking at the finalization of what's called the rulemaking phase, being completed and completely signed off on by the DOD by Q3 or Q4 of this year. And we expect to see CMMC requirements, again, which they have that audit component. You have to prove what you did, right? You can't just skirt by anymore. It's no longer the Wild West. We can't be gunslingers here. That we see these that CMMC requirements showing up in contracts under essentially DFARS, essentially under extended DFARS clauses, showing up in contracts probably Q1 or Q2 of 2024. So to your listeners, audience, your watchers out there, if you're not already working on this today, you need to get started. It's really critical, whether you do it yourself or hire a firm like ours or similar to ours or whomever, you need to get the process started because it can take 6 to 18 months to get this done, to identify from start to finish to get ready for actual assessment.
Right, so it's not quite too late, but it's getting there. So it's important to keep that in mind and start the process now.
For sure.
Well, Brian, thank you so much. This was a great conversation, and we really appreciate you joining me today. Thank
Thanks
you.
so much for having me. I joined as well. Thank you.